Welcome. I'm Riley Karsh.
I'm Tova Kopan.
We are thrilled to bring you the We Go Boldly podcast.
Let's talk big burning questions, life changes, and maybe a bit of personal business.
Let's be bold and brave together. Are you ready?
I am. Here comes the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to We Go Boldly, the podcast. We are so happy to have you with us today. It is a heavy allergy day for me, so bear with me, everyone, as I lose my voice to the pollen, the evil pollen, the wonderful pollen. We are continuing our conversation about unlocking what holds us back this season. It is a long season, but it's a long season for a good reason. It's a big topic, and there are so many things that get in our way. So we're trying to dive into all different aspects of that. Before I move us on to our specific topic today, let me do what I always do and welcome to the show my fantastical co-host, Tova. I, as you know, am Riley, and I am here with Tova. How are you today, Tova?
I think good. It's Friday.
Mm-hmm.
I am struggling with the concept that May is this week. So as you're listening to this, hopefully you're listening to it the day it comes out, and it is May 3rd. And I don't totally understand how we got here. To May.
Yeah.
I don't understand. We're recording this on the Friday before you're listening. So one of my goals this weekend, we'll see if I did it, is to get the rest of the summer clothing out. And I think maybe some of my disbelief is that it was really warm 3 weeks ago, and it has been not warm ever since. And so I'm just confused.
Yeah,
Flummoxed.
everything is off for me as well. But I love spring. I love it so much. And then I also really dislike it because, as you can hear in my voice, I am allergic to trees, all trees, just trees in general. Um, and so when spring happens and the trees come back to life, I sort of wilt inside. But I love this. I love the rebirth aspect of spring, right? Like I love all of that, all the symbolism, all the snow melting if you're somewhere where it's snowy. It's so refreshing to me. But time is different. Like the older I get, the more different time gets.
Oh
And I
no.
know they told us that would happen when I was a kid. And I was like, yeah, whatever. That's not real. That's not a thing. It's 100% a thing. It's happening and it's weird. So, you know, we're just sort of rolling with it.
It's
And
true. It's true.
speaking of rolling with it, today that's my bad segue, y'all. Today we are talking about, like I said, unlocking what holds us back, but more specifically, we're talking about worst case scenarios and how they can be used to our benefit and how they can be used to derail us. I'm going to use that word. And so Tova, I know you did the research for today's episode, so I'll turn it over to you in a second. But really what we're talking about is taking risks, making choices, making decisions, and being willing to consider the outcomes without attaching to the outcomes. And so that's a real hard thing to do, but we're going to dive into it, give you guys some suggestions, and let's do it. What do you think, Tova?
Yeah, this was fascinating research for me. I know I say that almost every time, and I genuinely mean it because I love researching this stuff. But this one particular, I read a lot more research that said not what I thought it was going to say. A lot of times I do the research and, Riley and I put together our season and we put together kind of our theories. And there have been times where we learn something that isn't confirming our theory. But for the most part, we're finding studies and support, and we're not seeking them out clearly by evidence by this research, but we're just finding things that support what our theory already exists. But in this case, when I started looking at worst case scenarios and how to deal with them, there were two pretty significant camps of psychological theory. And one was, why would you look at the worst case scenario when you could expect the best to happen, right? And that there's a lot of merit to that, right? And we have talked about, if you're only looking for negative things, you're only going to see negative things, right? Like we've talked about that. But there was also a very strong camp that talked about how asking what's the worst that can happen, and not in a flippant, well, what's the worst that can happen, but actually like being like, okay, what is the worst that can happen? And it's called negative visualization, at least by some school of thought. Had a pretty big camp saying, no, this is a legitimate way to help you take risks, to help kind of feel the fear and keep going, right? And AKA being fearless, which we don't think is a thing, but that's what people mean, really. Um, and so it was very interesting, and it was nice to know, I guess, that like there's a lot of research behind what some things like I've already done with my kids. Like I know I've already had conversations where, my kids wanted to do something, or they were upset about something, and they're like, well, I want to write this email or this text. And we sat there and we said, okay, let's think about all the outcomes. Like, how are we going to feel with each of those outcomes? And are we going to be comfortable with those outcomes? Um, and so it's nice to know that it's a real thing. Now, there will be a section in this conversation where we talk about how dwelling, ruminating, spiraling, all of those things about worst case scenarios is not necessarily good or healthy. And what is interesting about this is, even though it's called negative visualization, this concept came from the Stoics, which I guess is a whole philosophy of thought that I also did some research about.
Right.
But their main goal in life was to live according to virtues, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. And one of their main principles, and I thought this was really interesting, and it's something that we've talked about, but not in these words. Um, they said one of their main basic principles says that external events cannot be negative or positive, but only indifferent, because they are not under our control. And they want to focus on what we can control, and not let something that we cannot control dictate how we feel about our lives. And obviously, the death of somebody is a negative event. So like, we have to, but still, it's how we react to it is how it's going to affect our life, right? And so I think this is a really fascinating concept. And I really like the fact that they highlight that, negative visualization, despite the fact of having the word negative in it, is not supposed to be a negative experience.
Yeah, I think that's why I relate to this idea so heavily, because in my mind it's not a negative experience. And so, you know, when you are practicing something like this, something like what's the worst that could happen, conversations, either with other people or with yourself, it's not meant, and we're going to spend a lot of time telling you what it isn't, because it's just one of those concepts where there's a lot of that. But it's not meant to be the case that you dive into the worst case scenarios and they're all bad, right? Like I firmly agree with this concept of things out of our control are not judgment based things. They are just things that happen in life, and they are not good, they're not bad, they just happen. Even death isn't like necessarily a negative event. It's negative in how it affects you, but that doesn't mean the event itself is negative, right? Like there, and this is such a nuanced conversation, so it's hard to fit into the confines of a podcast where most of you can't see us and can't see our research or read the things that we've read yet. Um, but it feels bad, and it impacts our emotions and our feelings and our lives, right? But that doesn't mean the event itself is bad. And so when we decide when we're making decisions and we want to think about like what the right choice for us is, if you look at all possible outcomes and you say something like, what's the worst that could possibly happen? To me, it can be. And if you take, if you become objective about it, which is super hard, but it can be the same as saying, what's the best that could happen? Right.
Right.
Because the who knows? Like it's so out of our control that what you have to, or what you wind up doing is looking at all of the possible outcomes, some of which feel bad, some of which feel good, some of which don't feel any way at all. They just exist. And that's so uncomfortable. It's so I like even just saying it out loud, I'm like, oh, that's uncomfortable. Because it's out of our control. And being out of control, for particularly for me, but I'm sure for lots of us, is uncomfortable. And so that's why this whole concept becomes very, very complicated very fast, right? Because you want to move away from discomfort a lot of times, right? Like we back away from discomfort, we put our hands up and and walk out the door, whatever it is. But I'm suggesting the opposite, like dive into the discomfort and examine it, have a look at it. What is so uncomfortable about all of the outcomes that could be from whatever choice you're going to make, right? Like if you're going to change jobs, if you're going to decide to date somebody or not date somebody anymore, if you're going to get a dog, if like there's so many decisions in life and you can apply this to all of them. The question is like how hard is it for each one, right? Like if you're going to get a dog, that's a much easier, for most of us, easier conversation to have with yourself or your spouse or whoever than, somebody died and I have to like process that whole experience, right? That they're obviously two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. And I think, they highlight, they being the people that support this theory, that feeling of discomfort can be a good feeling because it's almost like you're practicing feeling the discomfort. So if it ends up happening, you're a little more prepared. One of the quotes, and I didn't write who I was quoting, so I apologize. But it's in the show notes. Recent psychological research tends to show that people who are able to accept unpleasant thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed by them are more resilient than people who try to distract themselves or avoid such experiences through strategies such as positive thinking. Now, we love positive thinking, but not if it's for avoidance purposes.
Yeah.
And, not if you're like silver lining your way through life. And because what this isn't doing is getting somewhere that you're not loving where you are and going, well, it could be worse. This is actually at the beginning. And I think that you know being able to look at worst case scenarios and being able to decide if it's worth the risk. Like you brought up getting a dog. One of my fears of getting a dog is that the dog will get sick or whatever, and need to go to the vet. And it could be like get sick, or it could just be like, ate a bunch of sugar-free gum or something. Like I just saw a friend post that her dog did that. And
Yeah.
it's going to require a really expensive vet bill that I cannot afford.
Right.
And then I'm making a decision between, I don't know what, asking somebody to borrow money or something, or saving my dog. And it is not a worst case scenario that I'm ready to deal with yet.
Right.
And so I'm making the decision. Now I'm getting close because I do recognize that the benefits, like to my family and the mental health of my children and myself, frankly, far outweigh. And that's what dog insurance is for. That's what pet insurance is for. And so there are things that I'm now getting closer, and the kids are getting older. And so I feel like we are in a less fragile state as a family. And so we can, because listen, I've had dogs, many dogs, wonderful, amazing dogs, but I had one that we had to put down because they bit two people. I had another dog run into a street and get hit by a car. Like so maybe I've just had all the worst case scenarios.
Could
And
be.
like, and I've had a dog, or my mom had a dog who got cancer, and she died when she was 7. And I think I've gone through all those worst case scenarios, and I wanted our family to get like emotionally and mentally stronger. So it is okay. I just want to say this, even though we're going to spend most of our conversation talking about not letting worst case scenarios hold you back. It is okay to look at worst case scenarios and say, yep, that's just not a risk I'm willing to take. And I'm okay with that. And like doing a true risk benefit analysis is an okay thing to do.
Yeah, and I don't view that as being held back, right? I view that
Yep.
as taking logical steps in your life to do the thing that's right for you at the moment. And that analysis, as you were just describing, Tova, and I think it's such a great example of this whole process at work, the analysis changes over time
Mm-hmm.
because what was right for you or what wasn't right for you 5 years ago might be right for you today. And that process acknowledges change and it acknowledges that our lives are not stagnant straight line experiences. And I think it's super, super important that we recognize that because life changes, our paths are not linear, things come and go. We become, not that we become different people, but we have experiences that change us and impact us. We get different jobs, we have more kids, we get married, we don't get married, but there's so many different things that get in the midst of who we are that
Yep.
what you decided 5 years ago might not be the same as today. The analysis might be the same in the sense of like you're asking the same questions, you're thinking through the same issues, but the outcomes might be different now. So like worst case scenarios for me when my kid when I had one kid and she was one are different than worst case scenarios for me now when I have two kids and they're 10 and 6 or however old they are. Gosh, that's
Well, and
terrible.
I mean, I look back at the beginning of COVID, and part of the hardest thing of the beginning of that pandemic was not having enough information to
Mm,
even be able to do this type of analysis.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, but
Just
that,
having fear. Just
yeah,
having fear.
exactly. And but that analysis of what's the worst case scenario, I don't know. People are dying. And the best case scenario of one of us getting COVID is that we're fine and we just can't see each other for 2 weeks.
Right.
That's not a good best case. And so now the conversation about COVID is like, I do not want to get COVID, but I've been vaccinated. My family's been vaccinated. The the type of COVID that's floating around, for the most part, is different than what was floating around originally. Like, there's a different analysis, which means that like I get to see family sometimes
Yeah.
and like go places. Um, and so I do think I think also going through this process of what's the worst that can happen.
Yeah. So we need to take a quick break and we will be right back and we'll keep talking about this and sort of how we can use worst case scenarios and unlock what's holding us back. We'll be right back, everyone.
Tova here. I'll admit, when I think of a coach, I immediately think knee-high socks, whistles, and clipboards. Is it because I love Ted Lasso?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's a good look for you if I'm being honest.
Thanks, I think. Anyway, that's not the kind of coaching we want to talk to you all about.
True. We are talking about life and transition coaching, though I do still love a clipboard and a tube sock.
Both Riley and I are lucky to have worked with incredible coaches throughout our lives.
Before that, though, we struggled with where to start, believing in what coaching could really do for us, and of course, putting ourselves first.
Taking the leap and working with our coaches made all the difference. They gave us direction and support when we needed it most.
Now, we are fortunate enough to be coaches ourselves, and we're excited to pay it forward.
We can help you figure out where to start, create a roadmap, keep you accountable, and get to living your limitless life.
Sounds pretty great. So if you want to figure out your next steps, check out our services at goboldlyinitiative.com/services.
We can't wait to talk to you. Now, back to the show.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the show. So, before the break, we were talking, as we have been this whole time, about how to use sort of, I don't like to say it this way, worst case scenario thinking. Um,
Negative visualization.
Negative visualization. I still don't even like that. I have to come up with my own word, I think. But how to use this process to make decisions, to move forward in our lives, to get through fear barriers, which we've talked about before. Um, Fear barriers are a natural experience for anyone doing anything that is new or even things that they've done in the past, but that feel new, right? Like that feel still frightful to do. Um, and so we've been talking about this through the whole show. And I think, we probably need to take a minute to, and Tova, you've mentioned this, but to talk about how it can also become really detrimental to your life to sit in
Yes.
the worst case scenario thinking, to make that sort of the the way in which you view the world, right? Like if that's the only thing you're thinking about, then you're running into trouble probably. And we're going to do our caveat where we suggest that, therapy is the way to go. Um, but let's sort of talk about that a little bit and explain to folks what we mean.
Yeah, so there's a few descriptions of what I would call, say, like when what's the worst case scenario goes out of control, right? And it could be that you are in a constant state of this, right? Where you dwell on negative thoughts, you ruminate, which is a harmful habit when it comes to mental health, dwelling on negative thoughts. It could be something that you get triggered to do. So you don't do all the time, but when you get triggered in a certain way, and I don't mean triggered in the popular sense, but I mean something happens and then you start spiraling, right? And you're spiraling out, which isn't like an official mental health term of art, but it is something that happens. And you're not, I guess, poor cognitive control is the best way, where you're like not really in control of your negative thoughts and they are now sort of controlling you. That's another thing that can happen. They also talk about catastrophic thinking, which is sort of a combination of ruminating and then, the whole point of worst case scenario planning, or negative planning or whatever you want to call it, is that these are things that could actually happen, right? Now, there's always the caveat that you don't know what's going to happen. Like weird things happen, but
Yeah.
that are totally not in your control and not at all predictable. So, but this would be irrational, like when you're focused on irrational worst case outcomes.
Right.
And then the other one is what they call like looming cognitive style, where you are really just sort of seeing bad, dire possible outcomes everywhere. And all of these things, I think, if happening a lot, frankly, even the spiraling one, which I think is the most popular of like, oh, I'm spiraling, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Like are ones that would you would benefit from seeking professional help to talk about them. And they all can be signs. I'm not diagnosing anybody with anything, but these are all things that could be signs of a more significant depression or anxiety or a variety of other mental health things that just requires a professional to look at. And I would say too, I think we all have moments. I know that there's one day a month, usually 3 to 5 days before the start of my period, where I spiral. But I text, like, I know it's happening mainly because I have an app that tracks at me and tells me that it's coming.
Right.
Otherwise I would, it still is happening when it's happening. And I'm still like, and usually I like text Riley or I text other friends. And then the next day when I wake up, I'm like, oh, I'm so relieved. Like
Yeah.
it's not as bad as I thought it was. But I watched Grey's Anatomy because I am one of the 8 people that still watch Grey's Anatomy. And it was last week's episode, and there was a scene between 2 of the main characters, and I know my mom listens to our podcast, and she's just at like season 5 of Grey's Anatomy, so I'm going to be super vague so I don't spoil anything 14 seasons later. Um, but there's between 2 characters, and one has some addiction issues, and she was spiraling. Things were happening and it was resulting in her spiraling, and the other character basically called her out and was like, you need to stop the spiral. You know what happens when you spiral. Call your sponsor, get to a meeting. You've been sober long enough that you can handle this.
Right.
People love you, people are here, but you need to stop it. But if you find yourself spiraling a lot, or even if it's not that often, but when you spiral, you really don't have control. Like, there are so many ways to seek help with therapy that are not expensive anymore. I mean, they're not cheap, but there's, Better Health and Better Help and Talk Space
Yeah.
and all of these things, and even a lot of companies, even if their insurance doesn't cover therapy a lot, they have maybe like 5 therapeutic sessions that you get for free as part of the insurance. And that might be all you need to identify some of your triggers, and then to put into place like a couple plans so that you're ready. I think for me, especially, like, knowing what my triggers are is very empowering. And so I can either be weary of them, or just know, like, okay, this is going to happen, and I need to make sure I've like rounded my support around me, because I want to get pulled out of the spiral before it gets too deep.
Yeah.
Uh,
So to just to sort of rewind a little bit and clearly differentiate between what we're suggesting is a helpful technique and what becomes, I guess, an unhelpful way of living, is that when you are going through this process of imagining worst case scenarios and making decisions based on, what that is, you're also imagining best case scenarios.
mhm.
You never do one without the other. That's what we're suggesting, right? Like, and really what I guess I've decided just in this moment that it should be called is imagining outcomes, right? Because again, it can be completely neutral. It doesn't have to have a positive, negative judgment on it. It can be just, these are the possible outcomes. I could switch jobs and love that job. I could switch jobs and hate that job. I could switch jobs and have coworkers that smell like, horrible body odor and I can't get away from them. Yeah, or it could be like I go and I meet my work wife and it's like the best experience I've ever had. There are so many ways of imagining outcomes that don't have to be like a positive negative judgment. And so instead of getting trapped in the possibility of failure, which is where so many of us get trapped, what we can do is imagine all the possible outcomes and make decisions based on what works for us in the moment. The flip side of that, of course, is what Tova was just describing. And that is when you get stuck and you're ruminating or you're spiraling or you're perseverating or you're doing these things that become unhealthy to you. And it does the opposite of what we're talking about, right? It
Yeah.
is the actual opposite. It just keeps you stuck, it keeps you in place, and it keeps you thinking about the world as if it's a very scary place. Um, and that obviously is not what we want for anyone listening to us. That is not our
Right.
goal.
And
So, you might be in the middle of that too. Like there might be middle ground on those two ends that I just described. And I again really, really encourage anyone who finds themselves in the middle ground, myself included, to seek therapy, to seek ways to deal with those moments where we, start to have the catastrophic thinking, like, everything, never, always, those kinds of thoughts where, everything's going to go terribly and we're never going to get out of it. Right. Um, yeah.
I was just going to say, I've had the experience recently of going to my therapist and saying, I think I'm depressed, like more than normal. And she was like, we kind of went through the session, and afterwards she's like, okay, so I think it's situational. You're just going through a lot right now. And you may go to a therapist and they're like, it's really hard for you right now. Like, you're going through a lot. So the way that you're feeling like out of control, or which nobody's in control, but like you're feeling out of control or you're feeling really negative, that's okay. Those thoughts are okay. I am going to help you deal with them. But and so there's a lot of benefits to, and we are going to talk about, like, just even talking to a friend. Like, if it's not something that you're comfortable saying out loud, like a worst case scenario, then that might be like a signal that this is catastrophic thinking or
Mm,
spiraling. Because
right.
if it's such a far out negative concept, like negative outcome, that's the word we're looking for,
Yeah.
um that you're not willing to even say out loud, then that might be a signal to you that like that's not a possibility. Um, and so we do have a lot of things to talk about on how we can help, other than therapy, like, pulling yourself out of some of these thinking. I do want to just take a minute to go back to imagining outcomes and ways to do it, and the ways that were recommended in some of the reading that I did. And I want to just highlight another thing. This wasn't like one article. This was like a lot of research about this. This was way more than I was expecting, and it was really fascinating. So this isn't just like some, random guy that was like, yeah, I think this is a good idea. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I just want to make a highlight that like this is legit.
Yeah.
Um, but one thing they highlighted and said that, practicing this negative visualization. So you're sitting there and you're like, okay, like the example of the, different jobs. It teaches you, if you truly do it in a sort of logical way, because remember, this whole thing is about not letting yourself cling to these highly emotional, potentially irrational ideas. You just think about it, it can actually help you appreciate what you already have. You're like, okay, I actually have a job I really like. It's not meeting my needs in X, Y, or Z. So, what do I need to look for? Like, what risks am I taking? Like, it can actually help you appreciate what you already have. It also, and this is what I love, because they talk a lot about how one thing that throws people off the most are surprises. When something negative happens and it's a surprise. And so, what they talk about is dealing calmly and patiently with whatever life throws at us. If you've, thought about this, and I will say, you know, two things pop into mind when I think about a healthy way of these imagining outcomes. One is a parent that has a bag with them that has band-aids, water, sunscreen, wipes, snacks, right? Like all these things. That is like a healthy imagining out, maybe a change of a shirt. I know, like, when I had babies, I would always have a change or two of clothing for the baby, but then a change of shirt for me as well
Yeah.
in the bag.
Yep.
And those are like realistic. Now, it's not a great thing when a kid pukes on your shirt or gets poop on your shirt, whatever it might be, because it
Right.
all happens. But it's not negative. You have another shirt, you just put it on. Like, I mean, I didn't wear white for like 10 years, but
Yeah.
I'm like still barely wearing
I
white.
know. I was going to say, I still am not really quite there.
um, but like that is a real, that is imagining outcomes and being like, I want to be prepared for them. The other situation is my now ex-husband, but he was always exceptionally good at this. It's what made him a very good ski patroller. It's what made him um someone that I was comfortable when we first started dating to go backpacking with, even though I had never been backpacking, because we were ready, right? Like we had a we had the map and we knew where we were going to get the water, but just in case we didn't make it, we had a water pump. And then just in case the water pump got clogged, we had those iodine tablets. Like we had, because you need all of those steps, and you need ice packs, and you need medicine, like you need all of these things. And I remember before we'd go backpacking, we would have everything spread out on the table. And there's a lot that you take with you that you hope you never need, but you also don't want to be so dehydrated because you can't find clean water, or your pump gets clogged. And so those are two examples, at least to me, where um, you can imagine outcomes. You're not attaching negative or positive to them. They are just like, okay, what can happen? What happens if it's really cold? I used to do a lot of backpacking in New England, and there was, so in the same day, I would have tank top, well, not tank tops because of the backpack, but like short sleeves on. And I'd be lathering up suntan lotion. And then I'd get to a peak and I'd have a hat and gloves and a raincoat and pants on, because that's New England.
Yeah.
And that's the White Mountains for you. And so, like, I think, to me, those are, if you're trying to think of like, well, what does this really look like in practice? Those are two things at a very like low level, not like big life choices, but like a low level, how it applies in practice. And so by anticipating these difficult scenarios, it takes away that surprise factor. And so you're ready. I saw that they compared it to a vaccine because it improves your defense mechanisms and resilience when it happens, when something bad happens. And I know that over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion of vaccines, obviously.
Mhm.
And I remember one of the arguments was, I don't want a vaccine. I don't want to live in fear. And then I remember talking to friends, Riley, I think you were one of them, where I was like, no, I have a vaccine, so I'm not living in fear because I'm
Right,
prepared. And it's
right.
a very like Boy Scout motto. This negative visualization is like very like Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts kind of like motto here. So I just wanted to, take a minute before we jump into all these different ways that you can kind of pull yourself out if it goes too far, to talk about how to do it so that it is like a healthy process, and that it can bring a lot of calm to you. I don't right now because my current car, knock on wood, doesn't leak oil like a sieve, but my old one did. So I just had oil in the back all the time. That doesn't make me a like, negative Nancy.
No,
um
no, not at all.
it's being prepared.
Exactly. And the difference, I think, and you highlighted it really, really well, is that when you employ this outcome strategy, right, you can let go of outcomes, right? You can let go of all the possibilities because you're prepared for whatever. And you understand that, like all kinds of things could happen that you haven't even thought of yet. And some of those could be, the best thing that ever happened to you. Some could be with the worst. Some could just happen and be. Um, and so when you are able to look at outcomes that way, you can let go a lot more of the things that make you afraid and the
Mm-hmm.
things that keep you from doing whatever it is that you actually want to be doing. And that, is the whole point of the season. The whole goal of our conversations is to help you all figure out what is holding you back, what's keeping you from doing the thing you want to be doing or taking the risk you want to be taking or moving in the direction you want to be moving or even figuring out what direction you want to be moving,
Right.
which feels risky in and of itself sometimes. So all of that being said, we do need to take, oh, excuse me, one more break, wherein I will sneeze. And, but we will be right back, everybody. In case you didn't already know, we love talking.
True story. More than simply talking, we love researching, prepping, and bringing this podcast to life.
We launched We Go Boldly with the goal of reaching people dealing with the kinds of questions and concerns that we also face.
Things like how to hear my inner voice, how to make sure my habits are worth it and stick, how do I feel my feelings and still manage to function.
After years of personal work and lots of trial and error, we realized we have a lot to share on these topics.
Now we've been broadcasting for over a year and we are proud of our podcast.
And to no one's surprise, we still have a lot to say and talk about.
We sure do. We need your help to keep going. Every episode takes time and money to create, and we would love your support.
So, if you like what we are doing, please support us by joining our Patreon community and becoming a monthly subscriber.
Join our Patreon community today at patreon.com/wegoboldly. We are so grateful to all of our supporters. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back, everyone. And before the break, we were talking about why and how this, outcome thinking, outcome strategy really relates to our whole season. We want to dive into ways that you can stop yourself from holding yourself back using this strategy or
Yeah, yeah.
misusing this strategy, I guess is the right way to
Well,
say
and
it.
and I think also like if you're like, okay, I'm gonna try this out, and then you want to have some like backups there so just in case it goes off the rails a little,
Yeah.
like you're ready to go. I was, as you were talking right before the break, I was thinking of the word like demystifying like the future.
Yeah,
That's
I
like,
like it. I like
and
that.
obviously like we're not in control and there's so much we can't control, but you know, there's this concept of, demystifying the future. And what I like to is, if we talk about it as imagining outcomes, we really can look at like, well, what about all the good things that can happen? Right. And so
Yeah.
I think that if you are trying out this process and you're only focusing on the negative things, and then they kind of get caught in your head and like you're on a loop, sort of like the songs that are in my head from Six the Musical all the time, blocking my ability to like, I literally said to Riley before we started, like, I'm trying to get a sentence out and I can't because the song is so loud in my head. But I think we've all experienced that with negative thoughts, right? Like
Yeah.
I can't even get to the positive outcomes because I've got stuck on the negative ones. And so
Yeah.
there are boatloads of way. In fact, BuzzFeed has, I believe, 27 ways. I forget the number, but it was a lot.
Fantastic.
Um, ways. And a lot of it's just little tweaks in your thinking or questions you can ask yourself, to recognize and question the negative thoughts. Because usually the ones that get on a loop, they're not the like, oh, I'll get pet insurance. They're like, but what if the dog runs out in front of the street and gets hit by a car in front of my children and this happens, blah, 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 blah. And that's not irrational. It could happen, but like, it's not, it doesn't happen every day. Like,
It's one of those kinds of things where if you get stuck in that thought, it's the same as if you got stuck in, well, if I drive my car, I might get in an accident.
right.
You might. And that's real and it's possible and it could happen any day, right? But that can't be the thing that stops you from driving a car. I mean, unless you're having what we're about to talk about, which is this sort of catastrophic thinking, the ruminating, the perseverating. And that's when we're telling you, please seek therapy. I'm not going to diagnose you,
Right.
obviously, but those are unhealthy thought processes that are holding you back from living your life, right? So, like, if you're so worried about getting an accident that you refuse to ever drive a car, obviously something is going on that's bigger than just the car and driving. There's a larger fear there. Um, so it should be a sign to you, like a flag. That's a red flag that something's going on and you might want to address it, right? But in on the flip side of that, if you're having just this sort of inkling of
Mm-hmm.
catastrophic thinking, the beginning of it, which I know, I mean, I'm going to be very honest, I get there, I still get there, and I've had lots of therapy. Like, it's human to have this happen. It's normal. It's okay. What we want to do is try to direct it to the extent humanly possible, because what are we in control of? Ourselves, our
Well,
reactions, our emotions.
and I think that that is really important. I just at my like networking event that I was at, I was talking about essentially imposter syndrome and how one thing that can be very freeing about imposter syndrome is recognizing that everybody has imposter syndrome or almost everybody. And so I think one thing that's really important is recognizing that you are going to have negative thoughts and you're going to have negative thoughts that get stuck and you might spiral a little here and there. We're not trying to keep you from doing that at the beginning. We're trying to help you recognize that and then figure out things that you can have in place so that you can handle when that happens. Like I've recently been talking with my kids about how to handle when they have a disappointment in a sports game. I will not ever be able to eliminate losses or bad games. There will be
Right.
games where they strike out every time they go up and they miss balls that they try to catch. It's going to happen. So what do we do about it, right? How do we handle that? And that's kind of what we're talking about because and I think the first step is to recognize, okay, I'm having negative thoughts and they're not helpful, right? And like that's like step 1 is just identifying them as not being helpful. And I liked one of the tips which said remove should thoughts, right? Even the I shouldn't be having these thoughts,
Yeah.
that is not a helpful response to having negative thoughts.
It's not going to stop them.
No, it's just going to make you feel awful.
Right. You're just going to feel ashamed that you're having negative
Yeah.
thoughts,
Then
which
you're
is
like, oh,
like,
I'm so awful. I'm
yeah,
having negative
yeah, that's the
thoughts.
opposite of helping yourself.
Yeah. And so, I think that you can recognize that you're having them and be like, oof, okay. I think one thing that's really helpful, and I think this is hard to do. I think some of the other options like find a distraction or exercise are a little easier,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
like question your thoughts. One description said, put your thoughts on trial.
I like that description
So do
because it's
I.
very um visual, right? Like you can
Yep.
imagine it. You can like picture what it would look like. You can take that whatever that thought is that you're having that's derailing your plans, and you can stick it in the witness box and
I
like
know.
have a conversation with it, right? I think that's fantastic.
And then I'm every face of the jury.
Naturally.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe some of my friends, I might invite like you and some other friends there to like stare down that thought.
Right.
Be like, what are you doing to her? Leave her
Yeah.
alone, man.
Yeah.
I think another big one is acknowledging how overwhelmed you feel, because I know that the negative thoughts in my mind definitely have more time to like plant and grow when I'm feeling overwhelmed. Like if I am living my best life and getting good night's sleep and drinking water and getting my walks in every day, my negative thoughts, they exist. I feel them. I think about them. They go through me. Right. But when I'm not doing those things and I'm not meditating and I'm not journaling, then I'm like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. I call the day that I always experience before my period my chicken little day. Right. Because it's like the
Yeah.
sky is falling.
Yeah.
Um, my anxiety is high. My patience is low, but I can replicate those days if I don't get enough sleep or eat well or like take care of myself. I can
Right.
create that day all on my own.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah.
Oh,
So I think acknowledging that like I feel really overwhelmed is also very helpful. Um,
yeah. Anything you can do to up your self-awareness is going to help you in this, well, in life, let's just be honest, but certainly in this scenario as well, because what happens is that we have these irrational thoughts, right? And maybe they're rational in the sense that, sure, that could happen, but they're irrational in another sense that we're obsessing about them. We're assuming that they're definitely going to happen, that there's no way out, we go down that rabbit hole of like assumptions and circular thinking, and then we get stuck. That's how you get stuck. So you can find ways to sort of break that cycle, which is what we're talking about, right? That's obviously what we're
yeah.
we're addressing at the moment. But like you said, you can find a distraction, which works to a degree if you are I think if you're having this initial sort of rumination about something and you can distract yourself enough to break the cycle of it,
Yeah.
that's great. If you're distracting yourself and ignoring your feelings, that's not so great. So it's a fine line, and you have to be, again, you have to work on that self-awareness so that like, what am I really doing here? What am I really thinking? What am I really feeling? Because ignoring your feelings will not make them go away. It will just stuff them down for a later date when they'll come out at a really inconvenient time. If history is any indicator, at least for me. Um, but you can also make a plan, right? Like
Yeah.
if you do something, or if you decide to imagine outcomes like we're talking about, you can have a plan. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be intentional about it, which is something I wanted to mention earlier. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big part of this process, is that it is an intentional process. It's not just like you fall into it and it happens, right? Like you sit down and you think about it and you do it on purpose. Um, so when you do that, you can make a plan. You can go, okay, if this goes off the rails, I'm going to call my best friend, George, and I'm going to be like, George, this is what I'm thinking. Can you give me a gut check? Right? Like
Yep.
that's what one of the things you can do to sort of derail the negative train that can get out of hand.
Yeah. And I think, some of the other things it talks about or ideas are, and I'm going to jump ahead, but like
Yep.
journaling and talking to someone else, saying what you're feeling out loud, uh, both of those things can help with the self-reflection. Like it's very hard to sit in your little spot all by yourself and be like, I'm going to think about this and I think I'm having negative thoughts and I might be beginning a spiral. But if you write it down, then you're like, Like, I mean, have you ever written something down and you're like, what? Like, what did,
Or
what?
set it out or say it out
Or said
loud,
it out
even if
loud.
you're
Like, you
saying
don't
out
even,
loud to yourself,
yeah,
right?
you don't even need to say it to somebody else,
Yeah.
although helpful. Because I think that sometimes we just have to get out of our, like, as much as we're like, feel your feelings, think about what's happening. It also, at the same time, get out of your own head and like put it on trial, like, however that looks like to you.
Yeah.
I think that that can be incredibly helpful. I like this concept of naming your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
um Whether it's, if this is something that you do a lot, maybe you name, and we've talked about this before, this judgmental negative
Mm.
person in your head. You name them, negative Nancy or something more catchy, that you want to call them. You name it them, and then you're like, oh, that's what's happening, right? Like, this person is unrealistic, and not unrealistic in the way the world likes us to think about being positive, but unrealistic about being negative. And I'm going to move on from that. One thing I did want to note, because I think a lot of us experience this, is rethinking expectations. Because I think sometimes perfectionists, especially, or so-called perfectionists, people who feel like they're trying to be perfect, um, they look at things as negative that are like totally neutral.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, that might happen. Who cares? Like,
Right.
right. And and I can see, as someone who likes things to be a certain way, I'd be like, but that would be awful. And I'd be like, is it though? Um,
Yeah. I
and
think when I just want to note that when it's important to be realistic about the outcomes you're imagining. And
yeah.
when you are a perfectionist or a recovering perfectionist, that can be, as you just said, really hard because sometimes you think an outcome is like a tragedy and it's just normal human existence. And like like if you don't get the 104 on the paper and you get 100, somehow that's failing, you're a failure, everything's going to fall apart, you're never going to like you go down that road. So we have to examine how we're phrasing and talking about and thinking about these outcomes, right? Like what judgment are we putting on them and where is it coming from?
Yeah, this is why, by the way, just as a slight aside, I very much think that there should not be A pluses in middle school,
That's
because
that's fair. That's
I
fair.
mean, I might have a child who is upset that he has an A in one of his core classes and A pluses in the other one. You've got to be freaking kidding me. He's a 95%.
Yeah.
Why does A plus even exist? I get it in all the other grades, right? Because it kind of splits a grade up into three parts: B minus, B, B plus. I don't think it's really necessary. I think we would all just be happy with a B and just move
Right.
on with our lives.
Right.
But I get it. But the kids who are getting A's, what? What? So, anyway, I digress. But that is an example of being unrealistic with your expectations.
Yeah.
Um, I think that, I'm going to kind of, in the interest of time, like bang out a couple of them.
Yeah.
Like, be more mindful, right? What does that mean? If you've listened to our podcast, you know what we mean. Um, meditate. Meditate can give you calming thoughts. If you're in a spiral, I do say be very specific about the meditation that you pick, because I have continued my spiral in the meditation.
Yeah, it's not time for a silent journey.
No, it is not. Um, but grounding work, we've talked about grounding. I mean, grounding can be as simple as laying on a floor, putting your feet
Yeah.
in the grass, hugging a tree, curling up into a fetal position until you yawn and reset your nervous system. I mean, the list goes on and on. But grounding, any grounding techniques that you've tried, deep, calm breathing. It is, has anyone, I mean, this is why deep breathing has existed, but if you have ever had the experience where you were very sad, where you were very joyful, or you were very before any feeling,
Right.
and you have taken some deep breaths, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Do that a couple times. Usually the very leaves, like maybe then you're just feeling sad, but it's like manageable. It is amazing how deep breaths can turn unmanageable feeling or thought into something manageable.
Yeah.
So those are some of our favorite things. Obviously, exercise, because exercise is just like good. And when we say exercise, just to be clear, at least I'm referring to moving your body.
Yeah.
Like it is, you do not need to lift weights. You do not need to go for a 5 mile run. Now you can, because those are super fun if you like them. Um, but it is just moving your body is what we're looking for. So those are some of the more like go to, we should be incorporating in these our lives all the time anyway, kind of ways to deal with this.
Yeah. And, you will figure out what works for you along the way, right? Like, and you'll have moments that it goes great and moments where it doesn't go so great. And that is also 100% normal. I think, one thing we try to do on our podcast and in our coaching and just in life in general is normalize some of this stuff because it's not the case that you're the only one who's ever had any of these feelings or these experiences. And as unique as we would all like to be, we're not particularly in this sense, right? We all go through these ups and downs. And so not judging yourself for the experience is a huge part of learning how to use this or utilize this tool that we're talking about, right? Because if you're judging yourself and you're going, oh, I'm shame spiraling, or I'm ruminating and I can't, but why am I so bad at this? Right. Like if you start doing that, then it takes you completely out of the process and all you're doing is beating yourself up and there's no value to that. That all that's going to do is hold you back. And that's the opposite of our goal. Um, so I just wanted to end with that. I know we need to wrap up and I know you have some homework for us to get to this week, Tova, but let us know how it goes for you if you try this. Let us know what your experience is. And if you are struggling, reach out. It is something we can help you with. We can work with you to make this a part of your process that is healthy and helpful.
Yeah, and just to clarify, and it's part of the homework, but finding people, and we've talked about this a lot this season, like finding people that you can go to that are not gonna like jump on the negative train, but also aren't just going to be like silver lining positive thoughts that you can actually have conversations with.
Yeah.
It's incredibly important. And maybe those are the people that you already have in your life, and you need to sort of take that relationship to the next level. And maybe you need to not subtract, but add people to your life, so that you can have those conversations. So the other thing I was going to mention, just as a one last thing is, we've talked about today, like, oh, we don't want to diagnose you, go to therapy. By the way, you don't need to have any mental health issues and you can still go to therapy. I just want
Yes.
to, I'm
Yeah.
sure we've said that, but like you don't need to be anxious. You don't need to be depressed. You don't even need to be going through a particularly rough time. You might just be like, I need to have some more tools. And sometimes someone like a life coach is in a perfect position to help you with that. And sometimes it's a therapist.
Right.
And sometimes it's both. It kind of depends on what it is that you need. So I just want to clarify that like you don't have to wait until you're like severely depressed to seek help.
Right.
Um so homework, and you can probably guess what the homework is, but pick a decision that you have to make this week. Like it could be any decision. It maybe when you're like if you meal plan and you're deciding what to have for Monday night dinner. Like it could literally be any decision, and go through the like practice the process of imagining outcomes or negative visualization or worst case scenario, whatever speaks to you the most. Um do that, right? Like do that process when you're making your decision, because we love practicing things. We love practicing big tools that you use on big decisions on little tiny things, so that it's the worst case scenario is pretty low grade. So do that this week. Also, just be aware of whether you, and this is not related to the first question, but just be aware if you do tend to negative spiral. And even if you don't, this is just a friendly reminder that building in some mindfulness practices into your life are just good to have, This is like therapy. You don't need to wait until the sky is falling to practice mindfulness practices. And it does not have to be meditation, although we love meditation and we would love to work with you and help you figure out meditations that work with you. But it could be just like in the middle of the day, now that it's getting a little theoretically nicer, like go for a walk around the block. Like that would be a delightful midday. If you think about it as like, I'm doing this to just like reset myself for the rest of the day, that could be a great midday mindfulness practice, so find just once again, we're going to push you to maybe build them up and let us know what you're doing. Let us know what you're doing that works for you, what maybe you've tried and it hasn't worked for you, and let's figure out why. Or if you have other ideas for different ways that you're mindful, we would love to hear that. And last but not least, one of the two ways, in addition to just talking to people in my life, that I know that I can stop a spiral, in addition to therapy, is our weekly circle, right? So we have this weekly circle of women every Monday morning at 11 o'clock. If that time doesn't work for us, but you're interested, let us know, because we would love to start another one at a different time as well. But I always know that if I'm having the beginnings of a spiral, that if I talk about it there, it usually stops, right? Like, and I kind of have some built-in times throughout my week that I know that I can talk something out and then it's coming, and I can just like not put the negative feeling so much in a box, but just be like, okay, cool. We're going to get to you. Don't worry. It's coming. So definitely go to links in anywhere that you find us, and check out our circle. We would love to have you join us. I think we will
Yes.
be back next week with an interview.
Yes, that is the plan. So thanks for joining us this week, everyone. And stay tuned for more on unlocking what is holding us back.
Thanks so much for listening to We Go Boldly podcast. We know you're busy and we love spending time with you.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. Head to Apple Podcasts right now to rate and review our show. While you're there, be sure to click that subscribe button.
Want more us time? Follow us on all the socials at Go Boldly Together.
Want even more us time? As in all the coaching pizzazz. Find us at goboldlyinitiative.com for all the info.
We will be back with more excitement, research, and deep thoughts next week.
Until then, keep on being the bold, brave, amazing people we know you already are.